Welcome to the Freedom Fridays podcast. With me, your host, Pete Clark, the Whispers guy. Work seems to expand to the time that we give it. And I've been investing my time, occasionally on a Friday, to explore how we use our time, our energy, our attention, and the impact it has on our identity. I've been exploring over season 1 some of the mindset shifts in the handcuffs of I have to the freedom of I choose to. And I've shared some conversations, some tips, some tools about how you might want to invest your own time, your own energy, your own attention. How you might want to, if you choose to, make some changes to your identity. How you might have freedom from I have to and design a life around I choose to. If that's of interest to you, then this is the podcast for you. In season 2, I'm going to be exploring some experts and asking them what freedom means for them. And trying to help people work to live and not live to work. Trying to help people add life to their years and not just years to their life. So let's dive on in, and here's season 2. Welcome to this week's episode of the Freedom Fridays podcast. I have a really interesting guest, and all my guests are interesting, of course. But my guest today, a lady called Helena Clayton, who lives in the UK, I'm hoping I can ask the right questions to get her to talk about something that is rarely talked about, certainly in our corporate world. But let's see if we can get there. So, Helena, welcome to the Freedom Fridays podcast. Nice to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. It is very, very good to be here.
Helena, I start with the same question. In the line of work that you do, what does freedom mean?
And I do love this question because it's got me thinking about it for myself as well. So I work in organizations as a coach. Yep. And I also work in leadership development, so designing and running leadership development programs for all sectors. So I think freedom is 2 things in that work. I think in my coaching, it's, well, perhaps across the piece, I think it's about helping people see that they have choices and options more than they know or more than they think or feel they do. So I think it's the freedom comes from just inviting people to see a much wider range of options and possibilities. Mm-hmm. And that also includes not just options to act, but new ways of seeing things, seeing the world, seeing their beliefs, seeing themselves. So I think freedom from stuck ways or limited ways, narrow ways of seeing things. And also, and this is becoming increasingly important to me, and I'm not entirely sure I have the words for it, but something about, I have a sense that many of us, not all, have ended up living rather dry lives, perhaps small, or shades of grey. And clearly this isn't true for everybody. And I think that there is something about, and that is a stuckness. And I think freedom is also about helping people live lives, live lives that are full of richness, that are technicolor, not shades of grey, that are multi-stranded, multicolored. And that includes having a life that nourishes us, that we feel fully alive in, and where, feelings or emotions like aliveness or joy or love, these are really front and center. I have a colleague who is from the corporate world, and she said recently she has chosen to put joy at the center of her life, and things are completely different as a result. And you know that I do some work exploring love, and so there is something for me about, if we put love at the center of our life, then for this podcast, what kind of freedoms might there be? What might be possible? What other choices might be there? So bit of a long waffly answer, but that's where your
Helena,
question takes me.
we chatted a little bit about before we started, and what continues to fascinate me and inspire me is when I have a guest like you, and I've done about 50 odd of these, and I tell them my style, which is I'm just going to ask one question and we'll take it from there. And I've never, ever been disappointed or left with, what am I going to talk about now?
Mm-hmm.
Because how you've answered that, there's probably 5 or 6 conversations we could have just in some of the things that you mentioned. And I'm going to have to think carefully, because there's many things I want to pick up on. I'm going to have to think carefully about where we start. But thank you. That's a great introduction to freedom from all of those previously held constraints. And I love the freedom from shades of grey.
Well, and what's come up for me hearing you talk there is a really strong image. When I coach people, and here, for example, if I make an amalgam of many of my coaching clients who start work at 7 in the morning, they finish at 7 at night, they spend 2 hours with their kids, then they go back online to finish off their work. And when I say something like, how do you feel about that? They kind of say, oh, that's not okay. And when I gently sort of explore, so what might you want to be different? The sense of fear or terror of actually changing anything in those structures feels to me like such a prison, you know. So I just have this sense, as we're talking about, we put ourselves in cages of our own making sometimes. So there's something about freedom. It's like, how do we help people find a key to, I don't know, open the door? Something like that.
And I think the irony is the door's probably already unlocked,
right?
But we just don't know it.
Yeah.
And you know, your example I resonate with, actually, because I'm probably in a camp, and like we talked about before, we've all, certainly you and I in this conversation, have done things over the years to look into why we do things and our belief systems and patterns. And I certainly have a pattern where if I'm not doing something, or if I'm not busy, or if I'm not seeming to do something that's important, it strikes a fear, and I would even go as far as to say a terror in, I start to panic a little bit.
I agree. I'm with you on that. Yeah.
And part of me knows that that's what's driven me. But the other side of it is, well, and yeah, it's terrifying. That's not okay. And toggling between them is a real mental challenge, certainly for me.
Yes. I wrote a blog not too long ago about tight and loose. You know, I live my life in quite a tight way, and part of my own development really is to learn to live in a more loose way, more kind of free-flowing. And it's a challenge. I find it hard to let go and to allow in more space, and it's hard for me, for sure.
I think you'll find this quite intriguing, Helena. I did a little bit of research on your background, and I looked at some of your blogs, and you can guess which blog I was drawn to.
Was it the tight and loose one?
Tight and loose one. Which I'll put in the show notes for people that are interested. But I just thought it just drew me, and I thought that's a fascinating way to look at it. So your start got me thinking about, I wonder what I'm putting at the center of my life, because I'd love to hear you first of all maybe tell that, if we can, the story of your client that put joy at the center. What did they do? How did they go about it? How long before they recognized the results? And then maybe we can dive into what if we put love at the center of something?
Yeah, lovely. So it wasn't a client. She's a colleague, and yes, and I don't know what she did, although I do know that over the last 18 months, her life has had lots and lots of change in it. You know, there was lockdown. She developed this amazing new online program. She decided to stop doing her PhD. She separated from her husband, so there was so much big upheaval. So I think there's something too about, and your 21 Whispers name is so right. I think life shouted at her very, very loudly.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to me what it is that allows us to have freedom. Sometimes it is a huge disturb, a kind of a catalyst, or there's a word I'm reaching for and I can't find it. But sometimes it takes a big a piece of upheaval, sometimes things that happen to us from the outside, to really enable us to connect with what matters most to us. So I think life happened to her in some ways.
Yes.
And when when stuff cleared, I don't know if she found joy in the middle of it or decided to put it in there. But you're right. What if we decided to put love at the center of our life? What might be possible? What's
been
your
your
scare?
Well, I don't know. I'm reflecting. I wonder if, I don't think it's not love, because certainly the people that I go around with, my friends, my family, sadly probably more as they come to the end of their days, they go, it's all about love. But I don't think it's front and center. It's in the mix, but I wouldn't say it's front and center. I wonder, I'm reflecting off the top of my head here, I haven't rehearsed this at all. I'm wondering if it's something about, so what shows up for me is busyness, doing rather than necessarily just being, busyness. And I wonder if there's something that sits beneath that around significance or worth. And I'm literally on the top of my tongue here thinking, I wonder if it's then got something to do with self-love. In a holistic sense, obviously not in a narcissistic sense. And so I wonder if you can share with us your understanding and the research that you've done about love. I'm going to guess it probably hits a few raw nerves at times. What, if any, place does love have at work?
Yeah, that really is the question at the heart of my inquiry, really. So if I pick up on a couple of things you've said there. So one thing that comes up through the research is just how love is such a provocative, problematic, difficult word to use in a working organizational context.
Yeah.
And the bit of research I've done and the ongoing conversations I have with people when I run workshops, etc., is really mixed. There's a sense of, and this came through the research, there's a sense of love is such a core human need. We are hardwired for love. How can it not also be, relevant or there in the workplace, right? It just is such a, it's the river that runs through all of us. That's one take. And other people, though, a fewer, but others also, just have a very strong categorical no, that love does not have a place in the workplace. Love is private, it's personal, and quotes from the research have been things like, love requires that I am vulnerable. Vulnerability is a weakness, and weakness does not belong in work. So there's a link between, vulnerable weakness, and that's not okay at work. So it's really tricky to bring into the workplace. And but yet, though, when I speak to groups about love in organizations, many people sit forward on their seats. More people than not want to move towards that conversation rather than away from it. So I definitely think there is an interest. And then there's the kind of, but how do we do this? How do we bring or talk about love in the workplace? And I intentionally use the word love. When I first started doing this research and said to people, colleagues, friends, colleagues surprised me particularly. I am going to look at love at work. And it was oh, sure, but you don't mean love, right? You'll be looking at compassion or empathy. I said, no, I'm definitely going to look at love. And somebody else said, okay, but you'll end up talking about engagement. So I definitely won't. So even, that we're okay, we're starting to get okay in using words like compassion or empathy.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of holding fast to love because it is much more bold.
It is.
So a real mixed response actually from folks, and understandably, right? Because it's we are so guarded and armored in work that it is understandably really tricky to then bring in some of the softer emotions, and love isn't always soft, by the way. But so I understand the difficulty of it.
And so how would you explain to someone, if indeed there is, and if indeed there is in the workplace, the difference between love and, say, empathy?
Yeah. So in the research I did, I said to people, what do you mean by love at work, or what do you mean by love, especially as it relates to the workplace? And I ended up with 6 kind of buckets of responses. Or was it 5? I'll work it out in the tick. So the first one was a bucket called care. Understandably, right? It's like, well, yeah, sure, that makes sense. So that was empathy, compassion, nurture, all the kind of soft words associated with love. So that it was care. Second came listening. So people felt that being fully present and really being listened to fully was an act of love. So that came out as the second kind of biggest bucket, to be really present for somebody, to give them your full attention, felt deeply loving. So
that's fascinating. And the reason I'm saying it's fascinating is my own take. So obviously I'm recording this from Australia, you're in the UK. I deal mainly with clients and people in Australia. The biggest need that I'm seeing that's not really spoken about, and it's my own assumption, in almost everyone I'm working with, is they're not seen, they're not heard, and they're not held. So there's I'm not saying desperation, but there's this need that's unmet about being seen, being heard, and being held. And maybe that's just my interpretation of there's a need to be loved.
I love what you've just said there, and it resonates for me very much so. To be seen, to be heard, to be held, yes. And I think if we can do that for somebody, I think that's loving. And I often use the word loving because there's a lovely academic, Stefan Cantore, here in the UK, and he will often use an ing, a verb. So he will talk, rather than love, he'll talk about loving, and I'll sometimes talk about acts of love. I think that is loving. I think that's an act of love, to really see, hear, and hold somebody. Definitely. I love that.
You've said there was 6
so
buckets.
There were more,
Can you refer to the other 4?
Yeah, so listening was the second one. The third one, I think there were 5 actually. The third one was some version of generosity, or and this isn't the best word to use, but sacrifice. So something about putting your needs second, putting somebody else first, putting aside your own stuff to attend to somebody else, really putting them first. And that is tricky because many folks already do too much of that. They abandon themselves in service of somebody else. So that's a tricky one, but nevertheless, that's what came up in the research. The fourth one, and this is where the love is not soft stuff comes up, is that, again, it was so clear that love is also about having a very strong no, setting boundaries, saying that's not okay, protecting yourself, protecting others, giving difficult feedback or tough messages. So that was, I don't like the phrase tough love at all, but it's sort of in that territory. It's boundaries. It's a very strong no. And then the fifth one, there were just five, I'm pretty sure. The fifth one was acceptance of the warts and allness of us, right? Recognizing that we are flawed. We have a shadow side. We do things we don't like. Other people do things we don't like. That we are flawed and broken and damaged people, and we mess up. So there's something about really accepting everything that we are and everything that the other person is. So care and empathy and compassion was just one part of it.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think there are other elements too that didn't come up in the research, but I thought about a lot since, which is, there's also forgiveness. That's a form of love. That's an act of love. I think creating hope and offering hope to people or to yourself, that's an act of love. So I think there are other dimensions too, but that's my.
Did your exploration touch, or how did it touch on a concept of self-love?
Right, it didn't. But what is interesting is whenever I run, so I have tried to set up some workshops exploring love in the workplace. And I've run several and many. But what keeps coming up time and time again is that people are less interested. That's not quite true, but let me say it anyway. They're perhaps less interested in talking about organizational love, because what keeps coming up is self-love. So, of course, there's the adage that we can only love the world or others to the extent that we love ourselves.
Yeah.
But people recognize that, for example, radical acceptance, that final one, so self-acceptance is perhaps the hardest part of that, or having compassion for self. Talk about having care and empathy and compassion for others. Actually, how do we have compassion for ourselves? How do we soften the voice of our, often, in my case anyway, vicious inner critic? So how do we put in practices or time to be kind to ourselves? So that's very often where the conversation goes.
I can imagine many people, me included, putting self in front of all of the buckets that you suggested: self-care, self-listening, self-sacrifice, self-setting boundaries, self-acceptance, self-forgiveness. And I wonder in a practical sense, has your exploration offered any, and I know this is, covering it in such a minimalist way, but any hints, tips, practical things one can do if one was interested in exploring how to love oneself better?
Yeah, that's really nice. Well, this often comes up in coaching, and I bet it does in yours too, which is to start to work with somebody's inner critic. I think two things are coming to me. One is inner critic work. So it's to recognize and acknowledge that I would probably say we do all have one, but that may not be true, of course. But to recognize that it's really normal. I can remember being on a workshop many years ago and talking to a group about how mean my inner critic was. And a woman was in tears because she thought she was literally the only person who had a voice in her head that was critical and demeaning and diminishing. And she was deeply, deeply moved to recognize that most people did. And she wasn't weird. So I think there's something about acknowledging our inner critic and then trying to understand its messages as not true, and then finding a way to build up another voice, a voice that is more coaching, more encouraging, more nurturing, softer. I know that's helped me enormously. And the other is another one about recognition, which comes from shadow work. It's recognizing that each of us has parts of ourselves that are, I don't know, kind, compassionate. If I speak for me, I have a part of me that is kind and compassionate and is a great listener and is generous. But I also have parts of me that are jealous, vindictive, cold and withholding. So there's something about recognizing that, again, that's just human, and welcoming everything. So I think that is often where self-love can start. It's big work, mind.
It is. Has it been your experience that once you begin the walk, you just got to keep going?
Well, kind of. Although that might imply that that I just have to keep working on myself forever, because I'll never be right or perfect or fixed.
Yeah.
But I think the journey is often so interesting. I think as long as we do self-development work in the spirit of, oh, this is interesting, what can that show me about myself, as opposed to I'm so broken and damaged, I have to keep doing this till I'm better, then yes.
Yeah. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, Helena, because it's reminded me of something I've just literally read. It was because I was going through a bit of a challenge with my own inner critic, and I was telling and reinforcing a narrative about loneliness and being alone. And I don't know if you've come across Michael Singer's work.
Oh, I have his first book and know it, and that one, Living Untethered, is on my to-buy list, and I'll get it the minute we're off this call.
Right, because I just read the first chapter, and it was so helpful and enlightening. I'm going to try and paraphrase as best I can. So we have this inner critic. The fact that we can hear the inner critic means we're not the inner critic. And I'm paraphrasing massively, and he explains it really well. He gives some really good examples. And it just helped me step back from, yeah, that's not me. Obviously, it's in my head, and it's a narrative inside my head somewhere, and it's there for a reason, and I'll try and welcome everything, but it's not me. And it was able to, it was really helpful in terms of me stepping back to, and it leads to the question, well, who are you? Which is an impossible question to answer. And I'm choosing not to answer that at the moment, but what I am answering is, well, the inner critic is not me. Which I think is actually, for me, it's been really helpful to just detach a little bit and put the critic in the passenger seat, not the driver's seat.
Very nice. Yeah. And you're reminding me of Michael Singer, actually, because in his first book, The Untethered Soul, I think it's called, he talks about the inner critic like a really irritating flatmate. That you've got this lodger, and it turns out to be the biggest pain in the backside, because it is so kind of mean, and but it just won't leave. And I love that. It's like, this other person in my head is me. I love that, Pete.
Yeah. Helena, you've mentioned many times, and we'll put it in the show notes, about the research that you've done on love in the workplace. Would you maybe give us some of the headlines that you discovered?
Yeah. And through other conversations. So the first, I think, is that when I asked people, does love matter in the workplace, sort of 90% plus said yes, it does.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, I recognize that's a slightly self-selecting group, because they chose to answer my questionnaire. I don't do the survey. If I did that randomly, I'm guessing it would be lower, but that's all right. Many people, though, said it was very difficult to talk about at work, of course. We've talked about what the research showed people defined love as. Right. But the other thing I asked about was what gets in the way of love being more present or talked about in the workplace. And I ran an event the other week called Blocks to Love. So this is also some of the interesting stuff for me in organizations. So one block is the pace we work at. You talked about busyness. One is the pace we work at. And I sometimes quote a US pastor who said, You can't be a hurried person and a loving person. And that is true for me.
There's a mic drop moment, Helena.
I know, right? You can't be a hurried person and a loving person. So there's something about the pace we work at. There just isn't enough room for connection, for love, for contact, for seeing and hearing people to come back to what you said. So there's something about that. Also, love is unhelpfully associated with sex, with romance, with religion. So again, understandably, folks might think, well, it doesn't belong in work, because none of those things belong. A third block was trauma. So there's some research from the UK, I think it's from the UK, no, may not only be, into childhood trauma, which are called adverse childhood experiences, and they can be as ordinary, inverted commas, as your parents divorcing when you were young, through to, being the victim of violence or sexual abuse or emotional abuse. And the research says that between 40 and 60% of us experience something like that. And what happens, what happens when we're a child is that we do whatever we can to keep safe. And that usually means cutting off from emotions that we find difficult or that scare us. So we shut down parts of ourselves. I'm no expert in this, and there'll be people listening who will be thinking I could definitely explain it better, but we shut down parts of ourselves. And we don't naturally bring them online again as we grow older. So for many of us, it's really difficult to connect with love when actually we had to do some fairly strong things to protect ourselves when we were little. So there's trauma and how that shows up, and that kind of just gets in the way of us connecting deeply often. So the blocks are really interesting. And also, love is gendered. So love is seen as women's work. And
is that right?
Yeah.
In what sense? So did the women say that and the men said that?
Yep. So a couple of things. There's because love is usually associated with care, that first bucket from the research, care is seen as stuff women do. So that's through the ages, women have traditionally taken on more of the caring work at home, children obviously, but parents, or mental load, emotional load in a relationship. So love goes into the same kind of thing. Well, that's women's work. And of course, the workplace is not a woman's world. It's predominantly a man's world. So it means that love is not especially welcomed. I mean, this isn't explicit because it's women's stuff, and women are not especially, this is perhaps stating it a bit too strong, not especially welcomed equally in the workplace. So yeah, it's and by far and away, when I run workshops, it's women who sign up. It's women who come along and are interested in exploring love in the workplace.
Wow.
So yeah, I think it is gendered. I mean, it isn't in terms of our natural innate hardwiring for love. Of course not. That love isn't gendered at all. But in the workplace, it being a blocker to why it isn't, spoken about, or that there it's gendered in that sense.
Which again staggers me. Sadly, doesn't surprise me. So, what do you think's going on? Because if I reflect on most of my male relationships, sometimes jokey, sometimes not, sometimes after a couple of beers, sometimes not, we would say pretty regularly, "Hey, love you, mate." And so we use the words. I don't know. I'm assuming that's what we mean. Certainly, what I mean. But it would be at its fundamental core, it would be the same love care, listening, generosity, boundaries, acceptance, forgiveness, hope that I'd love my mates with, that I'd love my family with. It may express itself differently because of the society we live in, but it feels like the same. And I perhaps would maybe express it less to my mates than I would do to my wife, Chris. So what do you think prevents men from going beyond the, hey, love you, bro? We seem to just touch the surface and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's perhaps more a question for you, Pete, but I'm guessing it's something about, and I'm really making a huge generalization here, that the expectations that are put on boys to be strong and brave and to be strong and brave. So, and not to show weakness and not to cry. So I'm guessing that must be a big part of the root system. Yeah, what sense do you make of that? What do you think might get in the way?
I think that's definitely part of it. My sense is that men more so, because obviously there's a spectrum going on here, there's a continuum. Men more so, because of that root system, have had it shut down and yet still carry it.
Yeah.
And as we carry it in our later years, it becomes heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier until life happens, which causes it to, open up, and hopefully in many circumstances, but I know it's not, it opens up in a way that's containable, in the sense of people can recover from and start to express and feel love and loved and be loving. But sadly, I think many people wait too late until a mate commits suicide, or a family member dies, or there's a traumatic accident at work, and we wait for those moments for us to kind of go, hang on, we've got a short life here, I better get really expressing what's going on.
Yeah, right. And it's often said, right, that the patriarchy and the way we've set things up doesn't serve men either. It doesn't serve women, but it really does not serve men well either. It staggers me, Helena. It absolutely staggers me that we continue to allow those things to happen, and that's a very powerful thing for me to take on board. Actually, the patriarchy doesn't suit me either. It doesn't help anyone really. So it makes me wonder, well, who specifically is feeding that it continues? Yeah. Right, and bringing it back to freedom, it's like, how are we? Like, when I think of freedom, I think of stuck and trapped, and how are we all stuck? I mean, not all clearly, but how might we be stuck or trapped in a way of doing things which we are that well, we know we're I tend to think quite darkly around the way the world is going. I don't think it's going to end well, and we seem to be very stuck in ways that keep us on that track. So just in daily life, it's like, how do we just gently help ourselves off a track that is not helping us?
And there'll be huge aspects of self-awareness to know that what we're doing is not helping us. I wrote a bit of a blog piece recently where, and it's borrowed from different aspects of what we've all read, that every decision we make, consciously or unconsciously, is a vote for short-term or long-term, current self or future self, the future or the past. And you can see that playing out in all aspects of our lives.
Yeah. And love the I forget the link, but there's a a really lovely thread, which is about love, is a choice. It's like if we have a zillion choice points through the day, we can definitely think, what's the loving thing to do here? And that's where Stefan's loving is really helpful. What's the more loving thing to do in this moment? Which can be a really lovely guiding principle. And that's coming back to your question, what if we put love at the center of our life? That's not a bad question to filter things through.
Yeah. I remember an old, I think it was a Stephen Covey quote, but he may have got it from somewhere else, and actually changed, certainly with my intimate relationships, the way I view my contribution to the success of a relationship. And it was love as a verb. Because, a young man growing up the way I grew up, love was something you kind of felt and thought, but you never expressed it. You never did anything to show an act of love. And when I came across that at a relatively young age, it completely changed, I think, for people that I was loving, their felt expression of what being loved by Pete was about.
Beautiful. And you're absolutely right there. There's something about, we're talking about love, but actually what we really are talking about is expressions of love. What does that, because I can have all the love I like in my heart, but if it doesn't show itself in the world, in our relationship or in something, then what is the point? So there's something about expressions of love or acts of love that really is what matters, I think. Thank you for bringing that. It's lovely.
Helena, I'm conscious of time, and thank you for your time. I like to try and finish in a relatively light way if I can. And so I've got just a few questions, maybe just to close us off a little bit. And feel free to ponder or give us your first choice. Just picking up on your last comment, actually, do you have a favorite expression of love that you like to give?
I think appreciation. Okay. Very often when I say to somebody, a friend, my husband, a coaching client, I really like this in you, or I appreciate that, or thank you for something. Those expressions of appreciation are so rare in people's lives that it often kind of takes people off kilter. Expressions of gratitude and appreciation.
And if we flip the question, do you have a favorite expression of love you like to receive?
Well, it would probably be the same, because when people spot something in me and then appreciate me for that, I feel seen and heard, right? So I feel seen. Coming back to your point, so probably that.
Okay. Yeah. Is there a maxim you like to live your life by?
Ooh. No, not really. Although for me, also what comes up is do no harm. So and that's not right either. But there's something about I don't know if I can contribute anything meaningful to the good of the world, but I can definitely try and not make it worse. So something like that, maybe. Yeah.
Is there a movie that you love so much you've watched it over and over?
No, there isn't.
Oh, okay.
I don't think I've ever seen a film twice, actually.
Is that right?
I'll think on that, but I don't think there is.
Okay. And then
okay.
Is there a book that's changed your life?
I am a voracious reader, so
I can tell.
I think I'm looking at our joint bookshelves.
Yeah.
Pete, lovely. No, not one, I don't think. I mean, somebody asked me the other day about, I read a lot of fiction too, and there are a couple of books that I've read a couple of times, and that's rare. And one is The Bone People by Kerry Hume, an Australian writer, actually. Just extraordinary. I think it won the Booker many, many years ago, and that's so beautiful. So yeah, The Bone People is the book. It may not have changed my life, but it definitely was, a beautiful book.
Helena, thank you so much for your time, and probably more importantly for humanity, thank you for giving some air and oxygen to the wonderfully important and such significant topic of love. Thank you.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure, and I've loved this conversation, Pete. I really have, and what I'm taking away to myself is a reminder of the kind of be seen, be heard, be held, and also this notion of freedom from that is going to incubate for me. Thank you so much. It's been a real joy.
Thank you too.